Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eula Hughes, and I am the Dean of Law at the Bor-Alaskan Faculty of Law here at Lakehead University. And I am pleased to be your MC during this evening's virtual presentation of this year's Harold G. Fox lecture featuring Professor Jocelyn Downie. Before we begin this program, we'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, but I want to assure you that your audio and your video will be automatically disabled by default, and at no time will your video or your computer screen be accessible by the moderator, the presenters, or any other person taking part tonight. The ability for us to virtually gather this evening has been made possible by the tireless efforts of Lakehead's Technology Services Center, and I want to express my sincere thanks to the technical staff for their assistance. If you have questions during tonight's lecture, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type out your question. And I want to apologize ahead of time that it may not be possible to get to all of the questions, but we'll do our best. As we begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Indigenous peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that our Thunder Bay and Aurelia campuses are on the traditional lands of some of this country's Indigenous peoples. In Thunder Bay, Lakehead University resides on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, a signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. And in Aurelia, Lakehead University resides on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people and the Rama First Nation. We also acknowledge the history that many nations hold in these areas and look forward to respectful relations with the First Nations, MAiD, and Inuit in the spirit of reconciliation. I would like to now introduce Elder Jerry Martin, who is bringing us a special blessing for this evening. Elder Jerry, I can get you to turn your video on. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back. Bonjour, Wache, Chego, Washte. Greetings, Earthlings. It's good to be together again, and I thank the Creator for allowing us to gather again in the circle, to bring our hearts and minds to speak with one voice and listen to the words of this wise individual that is going to be presenting to us. I hope that you travel safely and no harm will come to you and your family and your community. So be well, and let's have a good meeting.
Thank you, Elder Jerry. Thank you for your blessing and for orienting us so that we can go through this evening in a good way. Thank you very much. We will now hear from President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Moira McPherson.
Thank you very much, Dean Hughes. Good evening, everyone. Bonjour. And I would also like to say Chimikwich and thank you to you, Elder Jerry Martin, for your heartfelt words and your blessing at our event tonight. Welcome to Lakehead University's 2022 Harold G. Fox Distinguished Lecture Series. This lecture series was established in 2016 through a very generous gift from the Harold G. Fox Education Fund with the purpose of inviting leading practitioners, teachers, and scholars to our Bor-Alaskan Faculty of Law to share their unique experiences and viewpoints and to engage and inspire our audiences. And I'm sure all of you agree that we are very much looking forward to hearing from tonight's outstanding and renowned scholar. Well, I can't see all of you joining us this evening. I do know that over 170 people registered for tonight's lecture. And on behalf of Lakehead University, I extend a very warm welcome to our entire audience. I would like to especially acknowledge and welcome current and past members of Lakehead University's Board of Governors who are joining us this evening. As well, I would like to also acknowledge many esteemed members of our legal community, supporters and friends of Lakehead University, as well as special guests and dignitaries that are joining us online this evening. And finally, I would like to personally welcome our Faculty of Law students, faculty, staff, and alumni to tonight's special lecture. It is now my pleasure to turn the podium back to you, Eula, to introduce our Harold G. Fox lecturer. Miigwech, enjoy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mara McPherson. Before I hand things over, I just want to briefly talk about tonight's lecture and its topic. As you know, it concerns medical assistance in dying, and at the risk of dating myself, the memory of Sue Rodriguez in the early 1990s speaking on national television about her diagnosis with ALS and then the progression of her illness is a lasting memory for me. It's a memory of an important moment also in the civic development of Canada. Her story attracted so much interest and so much public debate. It raised questions about the scope of personal autonomy that the law should recognize, and also about how much traditions and the beliefs of faith communities should shape public policy. 3 decades later, medical assistance in dying remains a complex area of health law and of constitutional law. But since the Rodriguez case, the legal landscape has changed so profoundly. However, whether a change in the law also translates into a change in the lived experience, that can vary quite a bit. Much will depend on the people who implement the law. All of that to say that there's much to discuss and learn about, and I very much look forward to tonight's lecture. As I said earlier, there will be an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A function, and my colleague, Dr. Francis Chapman, will chair the question and answer period at the end of the lecture. And I'm now very excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mariette Brennan, who will introduce our guest lecturer this evening. Professor Brennan is one of the founding faculty members of the Boer-Alaskan Faculty of Law, and she teaches and researches in the areas of constitutional law and public health law. So we are very much on her home turf this evening. Thank you, Professor Brennan, for introducing our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dean Hughes. Good evening, and welcome Professor McPherson, President McPherson, Dean Hughes, faculty, students, and guests. Thank you to Elder Jerry Martin for the opening blessing. It is my privilege to introduce this year's Fox Lecture Distinguished Speaker, Jocelyn Downie. Jocelyn Downie is a professor of law and medicine at the Schulich School of Law and Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University. She is also an adjunct professor at the Australian Centre for Health Research at QUT. Over the course of her career, Dr. Downie has received a multitude of awards and recognition, including an Order of Canada, for her contribution to public health law and advocacy. She has also received the prestigious Trudeau Fellowship, a fellowship from the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Dr. Downie's research interests lie at the intersection of healthcare, ethics, law, and policy. She has developed an international reputation for her research contributions to end-of-life care and women's health. Her work has led her to passionately advocate for end-of-life care in Canada, and she has made significant contributions to this area of law. In addition to numerous academic articles on end-of-life care, she also worked on the Carter and Canada case, which led to the legalization of medical assistance in dying here in Canada. Following the Supreme Court decision in Carter and Canada and the adoption of medical assistance in dying legislation, Dr. Downie was appointed as a member to the Canadian Council of Academy's expert panel on medical assistance in dying. Please join me in welcoming Jocelyn Downie.
Thanks very much, Mariette. Let me get my slides up here. And we can get going. There we go. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, here is Halifax, but to be with you virtually at the Boral Law School at Lakehead University. I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in this evening's event. I look forward to talking to you about what happens when freedom of conscience and freedom of religion meet medical assistance in dying. So what I'm going to explore in my comments before we get to your questions is the following set of questions. First of all, what's the issue at the intersection of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and MAiD? And I'll say MAiD throughout the talk, short form for medical assistance in dying. What's the issue? Why should anyone care about it? What does the law say about the issue? And how can we get practice to reflect the law and also to reflect ethics? Now, I have to at the outset note a limit on the scope of my comments, and that is I am not going to be covering the intersection of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, MAiD, and Indigenous self-government in relation in particular to health. This is not because it's unimportant, it absolutely is, far from it, but it's because that is very complex and very distinct. I would flag for you that the Law Commission of Ontario will be publishing a report this spring on end-of-life issues and Indigenous views. And I think what we should do is all look to that and then engage with that and reflect on the issues as they relate to today's talk, but without my having gone into the law, the ethical analysis of that intersection. Okay, so what is the issue here? What is the issue at the intersection of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and MAiD? To answer this question, of course, you need to first know that MAiD is legal in Canada. It is legal if you are an adult, have decision-making capacity, are making a voluntary choice, and have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That unfamiliar phrase means the following: you must have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, and the condition or the state of decline must be causing enduring and intolerable suffering that cannot be relieved by means acceptable to you. Also, you must meet a set of procedural safeguards. So MAiD is legal. Knowing that it's legal, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that some people want to have MAiD, some clinicians want to provide MAiD, but some clinicians do not want to participate in MAiD, and some institutions do not want to allow MAiD within their walls. So you have a mutual incompatibility of desires, values, beliefs. You have patients versus objecting clinicians, willing clinicians versus objecting clinicians, patients versus objecting institutions, and willing clinicians versus objecting institutions. So that's the issue. Why should anyone care about it? Well, we have to talk about both the nature of the problem and the scope of the problem, I think, to understand why anyone should care. So first, with respect to the nature of the problem, well, then it can be illustrated through telling you very briefly about these three people. Ian Shearer was a man you see here who was in the palliative care ward at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. He had spinal stenosis, heart disease, and kidney failure. He was in incredible, intractable pain. But he was forced to transfer to Vancouver General Hospital in order to access MAiD. This meant an agonizing wait at the hospital for the ambulance, which was unfortunately delayed by a number of hours, and an agonizing trip across the city from St. Paul's to VGH, because with the spinal stenosis, every movement was agonizing. Doreen Nowicki was a woman who had advanced ALS. She was at the Edmonton General Continuing Care Center, which is run by Covenant Health in Alberta. She was forced to leave the property and go across the street for her assessment for MAiD. MAiD requires an assessment, 2 assessments before you can have it. She was forced to leave the institution where she resided and go across the street and be on benches having her assessment for MAiD. Bob Hergott was a man who also had ALS, was also in Covenant Health, and he had to go and do his assessment in a bus shelter off the property because the institution objected to MAiD. He then had to take a taxi to the Royal Alexandra Hospital in order to access MAiD. So you see that patients are suffering, and some are in fact not ever even getting access to MAiD because they can't make the transfer, either because they are too unstable, or it is too painful, or there simply are no institutions to which they can transfer. So we are talking about individuals suffering. By definition, if you're eligible for MAiD, you're experiencing enduring and intolerable suffering, not able to access, or only being able to access through painful means. Now, there are also, on the other hand, potential harms to objecting clinicians if they are compelled to participate in MAiD. So, for instance, if a regulatory body, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, says you have to provide or you have to refer, these are the concerns that have been expressed by objecting clinicians. There is a fear of or anxiety about being forced to make a choice between violating your religious or conscientious beliefs and risking professional discipline. There is moral distress that comes from being forced to make that choice. Some fear that they will be forced to leave a particular field of medicine, or leave the province they're in, or leave medicine altogether if they are compelled to participate in the provision of MAiD. Now, in talking about the nature, I also must flag that it is not just MAiD we're talking about, actually. This is a quote from the Catholic Health Ethics Guide, which makes this very clear. Catholic hospitals are not permitted to engage in immediate material cooperation in actions that are intrinsically immoral, such as abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, and direct sterilization. For example, vasectomies. The list is actually longer than that, but that's an illustrative list to show the scope of the kinds of health services that are not being provided within certain faith-influenced institutions. So in sum, with respect to the nature of the problem, we have on the one hand, requesters and providers, and on the other hand, objecting providers. You have the autonomy, so the capacity for self-determination to chart the course of your life and your death, or to chart the course of the clinical care that you provide your patients. We have conscience, the patient's conscience, freedom of conscience to access MAiD in their life that way, freedom of conscience of the willing providers who believe that that's an appropriate way to care for their patients. You have the suffering that I talked about with respect to the 3 patients I described. Dislocation and separation when you are forced to transfer from effectively the place you live in a long-term care facility, for example, to another hospital or a doctor's office or a hotel room to access MAiD. You have moral distress on the part of the clinician who is unable in an objecting institution to provide MAiD, to give the service that they believe they are morally obliged to give to a patient. And you have the challenge to professional identity on those same clinicians who believe that it is their professional obligation to provide this service to their patients. On the other hand, you have the autonomy of objecting clinicians. They should be able to determine how they practice medicine, how they practice their profession. They have conscience rights. And if MAiD violates their conscience or their religious beliefs, those are implicated. You also have moral distress for those who are compelled to participate in MAiD if they are objectors. You have, again, their professional identity as at stake if they feel compelled to participate in some way in something that they find conscientiously objectionable. And you have the institutional identity issue for institutions that are faith-based that see objection to MAiD as fitting within their mission. So that's the nature. What about the scope of the problem? Well, the problem is significant. We have a number of objecting religious institutions. We have a number of objecting palliative care units or hospices. And oftentimes, these are the only site for specialized care or they are the only healthcare institution for miles and miles. So to pick a local example for you, St. Joseph's Care Group in Thunder Bay is the designated lead agency for palliative care in the Northwest region. The Briere Continuing Care Center in Ottawa runs the largest palliative care facility and the only facility to provide complex palliative care in the Ottawa region. You've got Pembroke, Elliott Lake, Mattawa. They are all served by faith-influenced hospitals, despite their secular names, and they are the only ones for miles and miles. I'd also flag for you here a couple of numbers. So Covenant Health, which I referenced in discussing the particular patient cases, Covenant Health is in Alberta. It gets 88% of its revenue from the provincial government. It has 90% of the regionally available palliative care spots in Edmonton. And I would note 23% of Albertans are Catholic. So this is giving you a bit of sense of the scope. What do we know about forced transfers? What's the size of the problem in relation to forced transfers? We don't have a lot of data on it, but we have some. A recent study showed that 9.5% of MAiD deaths in the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority followed forced transfers. And we know that between 2016 and 2019 in Alberta, 125 people had to leave the institution they were in order to access MAiD. So in sum, with respect to the scope of the problem, we're talking about a large number of people and institutions being affected: patients, providers, and institutions. So we've got serious harms as the nature, large numbers as the scope. So I would say it's a serious issue that we should all care about. So what does the law say about it? What does it tell us about conscientious objection on the part of providers, healthcare providers, and institutions? And I'm going to talk about clinicians and institutions separately because the law is distinct on the two of them. I'm going to focus on Ontario, given the location of the Boral Laskin Law School and Lakehead University. So first, with respect to individual clinicians, there are obligations with respect to informing patients and obligations with respect to referring a patient who requests an assessment or provision of MAiD. First, the duty to inform. Clinicians have a professional obligation, a legal obligation to inform patients of all potential options available to them. So the fundamentals of informed consent law are that when I'm trying to get consent for a particular intervention or a plan of action, I must disclose to the patient all options that are within the realm of being available to the person. And MAiD is a legal option for people who might meet the eligibility criteria, it's a legal option. And so it must be disclosed. So there's a duty to inform. We see this reflected in the regulatory college standards, so the College of Physicians and Surgeons, College of Nurses, and so on, where they establish that there is an obligation to get respectful, non-judgmental informed consent, and that requires the disclosure of all options. So there is a duty to inform. What about the duty of effective referral? In Ontario, clinicians clearly have a duty of effective referral. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has a practice standard that says where a physician declines to provide MAiD for reasons of conscience or religion, the physician must not abandon the patient. An effective referral must be provided. An effective referral means a referral made in good faith to a non-objecting, available, and accessible physician, nurse practitioner, or agency. And the referral must be made in a timely manner to allow the patient to access medical assistance in dying. Patients must not be exposed to adverse clinical outcomes due to delayed referrals. Similarly, the College of Nurses of Ontario, and you may be saying, why are you talking about nurses? Because in Canada, nurse practitioners can also provide MAiD and do assessments. So we always have to be looking at what governs both physicians and nurse practitioners. So the College of Nurses has said practitioners who conscientiously object to providing MAiD can either make a referral using their own professional networks or institutional policies, or they may contact the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's Care Coordination Service, and they will then take over the care of the patient. So they are ensuring that the person gets access to someone who can assess and, if eligible, provide. Now, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, their policy was challenged in court in a case called the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada versus the CPSO. So the CPSO policy was challenged as a breach of the physicians' charter rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Ontario Court of Appeal, however, upheld the policy. They said there is no breach of the equality rights of physicians. It was barely argued in court, so that was sort of unsurprising. It said there was a breach of the freedom of religion of physicians, but it was demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This is the test for state action. If it breaches a charter right, it is only allowed to continue to exist if it is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And what they held was this policy, yes, it breaches, but it's demonstrably justified, because what they did was they balanced the rights of the physicians against the rights of vulnerable patients. And they found that the rights of vulnerable patients won out and required the policy. I'm going to read a long quote here because it conveys both the substance, but almost more importantly, the tone of the decision, because it matters both for this decision about clinicians, but I think it's also foreshadows what will happen in the context of institutions. So the court said the objective of the referral requirements is the facilitation of equitable patient access to healthcare services. There is a rational connection between that objective and the effective referral requirements. The effective referral requirements minimally impair the applicant's freedom of religion. Patients consulting their family doctors about those services are often vulnerable with financial, social, educational, or emotional challenges. Decisions regarding many of the services and procedures in question are time sensitive, and delaying accessing these procedures can prevent access to them altogether. There is compelling evidence that patients will suffer harm in the absence of an effective referral. The alternatives proposed by the applicants were directed at minimizing the burden of the policies on objecting physicians, not at advancing the goal of equitable access to abortion, medical assistance in dying, contraception, and sexual and reproductive health care. The applicants' alternatives would compromise the college's goal and impair equitable access to health care, because they would require already vulnerable patients to attempt to navigate the healthcare system on their own without any direct personal assistance from their physicians, whom they entrust to act as their navigators for healthcare services. The salutary effects of the effective referral requirements outweigh their deleterious effects, and therefore the policy was accepted by the court as being legitimate. So the bottom line here is that the court recognized and acknowledged the potential harmful consequences to clinicians. It also recognized and acknowledged the potential harmful consequences for patients. I apologize, there's a typo there, I just noticed. And it placed an enormous emphasis on the vulnerability of patients. It also noted that there's no constitutional right to practice medicine, whereas there are the constitutional rights of patients to access MAiD. So it's a very strong endorsement of the duty of effective referral on individual clinicians. So that's where we are with clinicians. What about institutions? Well, this is less settled in law, but I think the best arguments lead to the conclusion that forced transfers by publicly funded institutions are not permissible. You might think that they are, because you may have heard faith-based institutions saying, we don't provide MAiD, and nobody doing anything to them to make them provide MAiD. It's true in Ontario and in many other parts of the country, but not all. It is happening, and it seems to be happening without consequences. You might think that they can, because you say to me, well, wait, there's the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and institutions, faith-based institutions, have freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. You might say, wait, I read the Patients First Act in Ontario, and that says they can. Let me take you through these. First, the Patients First Act. This act says a directive from a local health authority shall not unjustifiably, as determined under Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, require a health service provider that is a religious organization to provide a service that is contrary to the religion related to the organization. a similar provision saying that the minister can't direct the board of a hospital to provide a service that is contrary to the religion related to the organization. This act says this is the case even when it is in the public interest to issue a directive. But first, with respect to the charter arguments, I would argue there are no Section 2 charter rights for institutions. There are for individuals. We know there are for communities of individuals, but we don't actually have a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada saying that institutions have a charter right to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And I actually think that if presented with a case challenging something like this, they would say, no, there is no Section 2, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, right for institutions. Now, what if I'm wrong? And they say, yeah, there are freedom of religion charter rights for institutions. I would then argue that hospitals can't actually claim that right, because unlike for instance, a school which is set up for the purpose of providing a particular religious education, hospitals aren't set up for a religious purpose. And that would be a part of any test that the court would apply if it were confronted with a claim of freedom of religion. If it said, yeah, you have those rights, it would say, yeah, but you only have those rights if you are set up for a religious purpose. And it's really important to note that the faith-based institutions in Canada have a religious history, but they are not set up for a religious purpose. They are set up for the purpose of delivering healthcare, for research, and so on. And what you need to do is have a look at some of the mission statements of the different organizations, and this becomes very apparent. For example, have a look at the Briere Center, the Elizabeth Briere Center, which I noted doesn't want to allow MAiD, is faith influenced, but their mission is, they are clearly not established for a religious purpose. So then the case, I think, would fall away. But even if I'm wrong about that, I think so, even if, yes, institutions have these charter rights, yes, hospitals can claim them, I still think that an institution would lose, because you're going to get the balancing that we saw in the case involving the clinicians. You are going to have the rights of the institution held up against the right to life, the right to liberty and security of the person, the freedom of conscience of the patients, the right to equality of the patients. All of these rights among vulnerable patients will again outweigh the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion claim. And I think that any court would say, no, you must provide this service. The other thing I would note is with respect to the Patients First Act, is it was a word in the section that I didn't put in red before. I'll flag it for you here, which is it shall not unjustifiably. So the emphasis there not being on the shall not, which was on the previous slide, but here is on the unjustifiably. You cannot unjustifiably, as determined under Section 1, require this. Well, it is justifiable, I would argue, to require that MAiD be permitted within the walls. And so, in fact, I don't think it would be a breach of the act to direct an institution to provide or allow MAiD to be provided within its walls. Okay, so I think then a reasonable conclusion is that, in fact, publicly funded institutions have an obligation to allow MAiD within their walls, and local health authorities, networks, or the Minister of Health can, in fact, issue directives against forced transfers and tell institutions that they must allow MAiD to be provided within their walls. So if that's the state of the law, and I said before, there are institutions that are refusing to allow MAiD to happen within their walls, the next question becomes, how can we get practice to reflect the law? And I would add in here, and ethics, because I think ethics has informed the law in this area and to an enormous extent. We can talk about that in the question period if you want. So how can we get practice to reflect the law and reflect ethics? Well, the first thing would be we could challenge a hospital's policy on forced transfers in court. So you could, if I am a patient and I am told this institution has a policy we don't allow MAiD, I could go to court and I could challenge that policy. I could say it violates my charter rights, and then the hospital would need to defend itself as a state actor and try and defend itself. And for the reasons that I laid out before, I don't think that it would be able to defend its policy. There'd be an additional argument to the charter arguments I gave a few moments ago, and that would be the requirement of state neutrality on the part of state actors in matters of religion. And I think that would be an additional argument we could make to challenge a hospital's policy on forced transfers. I think we could also try to mobilize in Ontario to get the Legislative Assembly to make allowing MAiD a condition of public funding, or to enforce their existing laws. We saw this in BC with the Delta Hospice, which was refusing, after some complex maneuvers in relation to board governance, was not wanting to allow MAiD to happen. And the BC government said, no, our rule is if you receive greater than 50% of your funding from us, you must provide MAiD. And so they were compelled. Mobilization in Nova Scotia also worked, not to make the provision of MAiD a condition of public funding, but rather because there was this nuance in Nova Scotia that there's this hospital, St. Martha's Hospital, which has a religious history, but is in fact owned and operated by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And so there was no basis, it just couldn't even be argued there was a basis for a claim of religious freedom to not be offering MAiD. I made those arguments behind closed doors and tried to get people to recognize that it took public pressure to get the health authority to compel the institution to allow MAiD to happen within its walls, or really just to make itself do that because it owns and operates the hospital. But why I mention it is not because it's the exact parallel for the legal argument that would need to be made in the context of mobilization in Ontario, but rather to show that mobilization of clinicians and patients and public can move governments to enforce the appropriate rules with respect to institutions, which is you must, if you're a publicly funded institution, you must allow MAiD within your walls. And then the third thing you could try is to mobilize to persuade publicly funded institutions to allow MAiD within their walls. And here I mean both literal and figurative walls. I think that's more likely to be successful with palliative care units, hospices that are not religiously oriented, but are motivated by a particular view on what constitutes palliative care. I think that public pressure may be more effective there. And I think also what happens, has happened in some places, is once a unit like that goes through a forced transfer, they vow never to let that happen again because they see the pain, the suffering, or the complete lack of access because a transfer can't be made. And they say, this is not serving the goals of medicine, the goals even of palliative care. I think public mobilization as against faith-influenced institutions probably won't be effective. And we will need to either convince provincial governments to compel by enforcing their own rules, or we will need to litigate and have the courts force this matter by saying that policy violates the charter and it violates charter rights of patients or clinicians who actually want to provide MAiD, because that's another group whose conscience rights are implicated in all of this, says, no, that's a breach of the charter and it's not saved. It's not demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society because we do that balancing of vulnerable patients as against a quite powerful institution. So the bottom lines here are the following. I believe we have the best MAiD system in the world. We have learned from those who have gone before. We have taken the best and left the worst behind. And we have a system we really can be very proud of. That said, I think forced transfers are a blight on the system. They cause an enormous amount of suffering. They breach people's charter rights, which are our fundamental rights and freedoms, and they are, I think, indefensible. So I think we need to stop the practice of forced transfers. We have to work to see that stopped. I also think that we should be doing public education, and I see this event as a part of that philosophy. We need to let everybody know about the right to refer, so clinicians know that they actually don't have to provide MAiD. Nobody is forced to provide MAiD in Canada. They have a right to refer, make sure there's an effective transfer of care. It's also critically important for patients to understand that they have a right to effective referral if their clinician is a conscientious objector, and they have a right to remain and receive MAiD where they are, even if the institution is a conscientious objector. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions and give you the opportunity to fire away. If there's anything that you would like me to give more information about or something I didn't cover that you're curious about, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing here, and that will be facilitated by Frances.
That's so great. Thank you, Dr. Downie, for your presentation. That was just outstanding. I think we're all virtually clapping out there. It's hard to do so on a screen like this, but thank you so much for that. And thank you for taking our questions this evening as well. We've had quite a few come in. Many of you know me. I'm Dr. Frances Chapman, one of the founding faculty members here at the Faculty of Law. I'm so happy to see so many alumni and current students here. I think I've taught every single one of you who's here tonight. So thank you for coming, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of great questions that I can pose to Dr. Downie. So the first one that we have, Dr. Downie, is one. Practicing medicine involves numerous ethical decisions. Doesn't it make sense to allow and even require doctors to bring their conscience to that work?
Absolutely. I could not agree with that more. I believe that physicians and nurse practitioners are moral agents. We want them to be active moral agents, to interrogate their own beliefs and values, to interrogate the beliefs and values of their profession, and to act in accordance with their beliefs and values. That said, that doesn't mean their beliefs and values get to trump the rights and freedoms of vulnerable patients. So to me, the position I take isn't denying the importance of conscience and moral agency and religious beliefs, but rather it's to say, when I have to do a balance, which I do in these circumstances, I will balance it in favor of the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, the right to equality, the freedom of conscience of patients, and recognizing the vulnerability of patients in relation to clinicians. Patients, a lot of them don't have the power to just say to a clinician, I don't care what you think, I'm going to go find something for myself. We really have to protect the people who are not as privileged and powerful as probably many of the people who are on this call tonight are. So yes, please don't take anything I say as suggesting we don't want serious moral agency. It's just we also need some moral humility and a recognition that as professionals, we serve others, and we must place vulnerable patients ahead of ourselves in relation to a duty of effective referral. We're not talking a duty to provide.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting question just came in on my feed as you were speaking there. One of the attendees asked, can you comment on the issues that arise with respect to MAiD for people whose sole underlying issue is a mental disorder?
Oh, sure. So that's a very live issue right now. Maybe I can explain, just give a little background on that so people can understand the current debate. You heard Eula mention the Carter decision at the beginning, which was the Supreme Court of Canada decision, which said the ban on assisted dying is unconstitutional. It must go. We then got, and that decision did not say that people with mental disorders as their sole underlying condition could not have access to MAiD. It said if you have a grievous and irremediable medical condition causing enduring and intolerable suffering, you must be able to have access to MAiD. And indeed, people with mental disorder as their sole underlying condition accessed MAiD after Carter. But what happened is, just in the most recent iteration of the legislation called Bill C7, the government put in an exclusion clause that said, the condition, remember I said before, serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, put a little asterisk next to that and said, mental illness does not count as a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability for the purposes of this provision. But there's an asterisk on the asterisk, which is this exclusion will be gone in March 2023. It's called a sunset clause. It's gone then. Because what they were trying to do is say, we need a couple of years to figure out whether we need clinical guidance, professional standards, systems in place to deal with these kinds of cases in which mental illness is a factor. And there's an independent expert panel that has been tasked with coming back with recommendations about just that. They will come back in March of this year, in theory, COVID depending, I suppose, with recommendations about how we do it. So the debate right now is not about whether we do it in Canada. That decision's been made by the federal parliament, and it was indeed made back in Carter, right? Under the charter, people should have access. But what we're trying to figure out now is the how. So should there be any different procedural safeguards or different protections that are put in place because of specific vulnerabilities? The thing I would say, so now that was a long-winded way of getting to the question about what should it be. I don't think we can justify drawing a distinction between mental and physical illnesses and saying, if you have a mental illness as your sole underlying condition, you can't have access to MAiD. But if you know the complexities are too much, the uncertainties are too much, the vulnerabilities are too much. But over here, two things are over here. One is just a physical disorder. The other is the fact that you can have if you have a physical and a mental illness, you're currently eligible. So we've already got all the complexities of mental illness. So it's that mental illness is not unique. There is nothing about mental illness that is all and only mental illness. So what's happening, I think, when we have this debate is we're mistaking mental illness, the diagnosis, as the correct proxy for what we're worried about. And my response is, let's talk about what we're worried about and let's make sure we have the safeguards there to deal with those, which means let's figure out capacity, let's figure out irremediability and so on, but it applies to mental and physical. So that's where we are with mental illness right now. Watch for the expert report, and maybe the federal government will do something. Also flag for you, there was a committee of the National Assembly in Quebec that just issued a report, and they just recommended that mental disorders be excluded on a more permanent basis. I don't think that the National Assembly will do that because I think they will recognize the discriminatory nature of doing so and so on. But these are the things, these are definitely moving parts right now for that issue.
Thank you, that's great. Another question that came in, what legal protections are available to medical staff who do not wish to be involved in MAiD for conscientious or religious reasons?
Well, they cannot be forced to provide. They can't be forced to be present or to do assessments. So those are very significant protections. That is a real compromise in our system, because you arguably could just say you're a doc, you have to do all the legal services. We haven't said that, but so I think that is a very significant protection, but they do have to provide an effective referral transfer of care. It can be very, very, very easy to do. There are offices where they know that this person is an objector. So all they do when somebody raises it, they get up, they walk out the door, they, click a button, and a willing provider is engaged in the process. That's what they have to do. Or they call the navigator. We have MAiD navigators across the country. They call the navigator and say, I have this patient, I will transfer to you, and that navigator will find the provider. So the protection is there in the sense that they don't have to provide, the quote unquote participation is actually small. But if they do not refer, they are subject to professional discipline because they are in breach of a practice standard of the college. And in fact, they would be in breach across almost the entire country. We have we talk about an effective transfer of care as opposed to referral. I do like that actually, but that's the protection. You don't have to do almost anything, but when you don't do the minimum that is required, you will be subject to professional discipline.
There's a lot of questions coming in about forced transfers. I think this one kind of sums up a lot of the comments we're getting. This attendee says, why aren't local health integrated networks or ministers issuing directives against forced transfers, given the increased acceptance of MAiD by the general population?
If somebody on this call knows, please tell me. That would be my facetious answer. It's politics is a big part of it. I have been told by some very seasoned politicians that part of this is a function of single issue voting and being targeted by the right to life groups. So someone like me, I don't vote based only on what somebody says about MAiD, right? I'm going to vote on a whole host of other things. But there is a phenomenon, not all right to life people, not all people who are opposed to MAiD are this, but it's a sufficient group to cause political concern. They will, and they will target. And we have seen that. And so people get targeted to get voted out if they are supportive of MAiD, or if they acted in a way that would be seen to be forcing St. Martha's or St. Joseph's or Covenant Health to provide MAiD, they would be targeted politically in an election. That is one reason. Another reason would be they don't understand the law. They think they can't. If you read the Patients First Act, I purposefully did it in a way that you didn't see the unjustifiably first, because that's the experience a lot of politicians would have. They'd read that and they think, I can't do that. Because of course you can't do anything unjustifiably, but they don't necessarily know that unjustifiably is a key word in terms of the charter. And that's the flag that tells us you can. I don't know how that came to be in there. I don't know whether it was, some legal person in the back objecting to the act and sort of saying, I'm putting that in so that people know, of course it's subject to the charter. I don't know, but it may be they don't understand the law. It may be they don't want to pay the political price. It may be that they are really fearful of the impact on the healthcare system if the religious organizations withdraw, right? Because it's a huge part of some provinces, some cities, regions, and these institutions can be absolutely beloved in these centers. And so they don't want to risk at a time when our healthcare system is so stretched and stressed, they don't want to risk upsetting all of that. That's my speculation for why they don't. And what we've seen frequently in this area is the way to move governments is to go to court, right? We got MAiD by going to court. We didn't get it by persuading somebody to put a bill in front of the federal parliament. Lots of bills went in front of federal parliament and never got anywhere. You get it by going to court. Sometimes that's because court provides a cover for politicians, right? You're forced to do it. So it may be that that's going on too. I don't know. I just hope that you will have a government at some point that will say this is wrong and we are going to do this as they did in BC, or as in Nova, where we are in Nova Scotia, in Newfoundland. In Quebec also, I would flag, Quebec has in its legislation that institutions are not allowed to do forced transfer. There's an exception for some palliative centers, but they're not, faith-based institutions are not allowed to do forced transfers. That's in their legislation. There you've got all the politics and the differences between Quebec and the rest of Canada about religion. So that's my thinking in relation to that great question.
That's a great answer. Another theme we seem to have a lot about are advanced health directives. So we have one question. One area of debate has been whether MAiD should be available as part of an advanced healthcare directive. Can you speak to the advantages and disadvantages of allowing people to direct that they wish to have medical assistance in dying under certain defined circumstances in case they lose capacity to give that direction later on?
Right. So I am an advocate of advance requests for MAiD in certain circumstances. And here's why. One, it's about autonomy, the capacity for self-determination. It's for me to get to direct the course of my life and the course of my death. We have reflected our commitment to autonomy in the way we approach what are called advance directives, right? I get to put in a document or tell my substitute decision maker, if I'm in such and such a situation, please stop all treatment. I can even say stop food and water, and I will die. So I can give instructions that will inevitably lead to my death. So we've already made that commitment grounded in the principle of autonomy. So I think autonomy plays a part. I think, ironically, it lengthens life, because what happens, and we have seen this, is if you know that you can have MAiD in the future, should you lose capacity, then you will often choose to live longer because you want to live longer. But if you don't have the capacity for an advance request, you die sooner because you think, I've got to have MAiD before I lose capacity. We have this in a very clear form in the case of Audrey Parker in Nova Scotia, who had breast cancer and it had spread and she was at risk of loss of capacity. It was the fall. She wanted to live through the Christmas and New Year's season because it was her favorite time of year and she wanted to spend it with friends and family, but she was at risk of losing capacity. If she at the time could have had an advance request, she would have said, okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm eligible for MAiD, but I'm going to keep going. If I lose capacity before January 10th, give me MAiD. But it gives me a chance to try to make it through. Because she didn't have that option, she had MAiD on November 1st of the year in which her story broke. Now, her case has been fixed because in the most recent legislative change, we now have something called a final consent waiver. So somebody in Audrey's circumstance, which is completely eligible for MAiD, you meet all the criteria, so you're already experiencing enduring and intolerable suffering, you can do what Audrey wanted. That's why it's known as Audrey's Amendment. You can do that. But what people want now is to not have to be in that state of intolerable suffering yet, and to be able to have the comfort of knowing, like I say I've got dementia, I want to know that when I become incapable, I will be able to have MAiD. So that allows me to express my autonomy. It means I will live longer. I'll choose to live longer because I won't have to get it right before I lose capacity. It gives me the comfort, the relief from anxiety of worrying that I'm going to miss my moment and I'm not going to have access to MAiD. So those are the reasons that I think advance requests are a positive development. We've already got a partial development, and what's happening now is we're looking at them right now. There's a federal review, there's a parliamentary review that's supposed to be looking at advance requests. It's stalled, but that's its mandate. It's supposed to be reporting in March or April of this year. But that's part of its mandate, is to look at, should we open up, in a sense, open up final consent waivers and say, look, once you have a serious and incurable condition, maybe once you're in an advanced state of decline and capability or not, but before you are experiencing enduring and intolerable suffering, we want to allow you to set up MAiD in the future should you lose capacity. Flag here also, just quickly before handing it back to you, Quebec is moving in that direction. They have already had one expert group recommend to them that they allow advance requests of this sort. They just had a committee, the same one that made the recommendations about mental health, has made the recommendation to expand advance requests to a broader group of people. And I do believe that that will be happening in Quebec quite soon. I don't know whether they'll fit it in before their election, but the political will is very strong there for this, because in part the public support for advance requests is massive, and it's been massive for years. So this is an interesting moment where we see, will Parliament or the National Assembly in Quebec, will they move without being forced to move by the courts? And will they listen to the consultations that they've done? Because I'd note they did a public consultation on Bill C7, which I told you is the most recent piece of legislation that passed. Over 300,000 people responded to that online consultation, largest ever, and overwhelmingly support advance requests. So the public's there, and there are good philosophical, moral reasons, I think, for supporting advance requests.
Yeah, and several of the questions that have come in have specifically mentioned dementia and Alzheimer's. So I think that's such an important part to, with an aging population, that's a very real concern. Absolutely. People are very fearful. One thing people do need to know is you actually can still qualify for MAiD with dementia. It's just trickier because you have to pay close attention to the timing. And you have to meet the criteria, and sometimes you don't meet the criteria at the same time. So it is important for people not to think you can never. If you have dementia or a loved one has dementia, do talk to a really knowledgeable MAiD assessor or provider to see whether you could. But you have to be a whole lot closer than what a lot of people want, which is tell me now, let me say now, before I'm eligible in that way, that this is what I'm going to want. And then I can relax and I can enjoy the rest of my life without worrying about ending up in a state that I don't want to be in at the end. Which is so interesting, as you mentioned too, that could actually extend the time that many people actually do live. I think that's absolutely. And interestingly, people sometimes are puzzled by in the Carter case, one of the things they found was it's a violation of the right to life not to have access to MAiD. And it's sort of like, how's that? But it's precisely that, is that people in that case, people were commenting on the fact that you would have to end your life by suicide while you still could, because once you became too incapacitated, you wouldn't be able to. So people's lives were shorter by virtue of their not being MAiD. And so that argument is continuing here, which is to say lives will be shorter without advance requests. Yeah, and we had another question that kind of as in this related way as well. Is there more of a conversation among Canadians about this broader right to die? Do you think this has opened up other discussions for individuals? Well, I think it's opened up end-of-life conversations. I've heard that from clinicians because what happened in the past, some of these discussions were happening, but they're sort of shrouded a little bit of a fear of liability, because if I talk to a patient about stopping treatment or having a do not resuscitate order or terminal sedation, is somebody going to think that I'm talking to them about euthanasia and that's illegal and there'll be huge ramifications and I'll be hauled away? There was some fear associated with having the broad end of life conversations, for fear of being misunderstood to be talking about something illegal. Once it's legal, you don't have that fear. So you actually can more safely have the conversations that affect the vast majority of people who are dying, which is not MAiD cases, right? MAiD cases right now are about 2.5%. At most, I think we'll go up to 4 or 5%. So there's all those other people who are going through end of life care
whose conversations will be enhanced because we can more freely talk about the whole spectrum of end-of-life care without fear of criminal liability or civil liability or somebody thinking that we're doing something that's wrong. So I think it's improving end-of-life care. We've seen that happen in some data coming out of Oregon, which has had it for a long time. We're sort of more talking about it. I don't know, people on the call can be thinking about whether you've yet, how many degrees of separation are you from a case of MAiD? And it's been getting closer and closer and closer to me, the degrees of separation. I am now 1 degree of separation, you know, and that's happening. And what that means is we're talking about it. Right? I was in a taxi going to a board meeting with a fellow board member, and she said, "Oh yeah, Jocelyn, I meant to tell you, my family member had MAiD." And then we had a conversation about end of life. And so I think we're talking more about end of life because we've had the huge, you know, the massive conversation about the legislation and the cases and so on, but also now because we're talking more about end of life, and that's a good thing. We should also be talking more about palliative care. I'm a huge supporter of palliative care. Palliative care and MAiD are not in opposition. That may be one message I hope people take away. They are not in opposition. You can be a huge supporter of both. They are both important parts of the toolbox for clinicians, and more people will be benefited and will take advantage of palliative care, I should say, and other forms of end-of-life decision-making than MAiD. So let's talk about it all.
Talk about everything, absolutely. Going back to the legislation for a moment, we had a question about what do you see as key governance concerns in MAiD? Do you see some concerns that are on the horizon?
Well, I mean, the one coming out of the topic for today is actually, will governments do their job, which is defend the charter rights of Canadians? Will they ensure that these forced transfers stop and people can have access to MAiD where they are? So that would be a big one. Not directly tied to the conscience issue. I think we have a curious situation with Quebec. People may not know, but Quebec actually legalized MAiD all on its own. Back in 2015, it passed legislation. It was ahead of everybody. It passed legislation and had a medical aid in dying regime. And it did this under the auspices of its authority over health. And that, you know, MAiD is a funny thing, right? Because it's in the criminal law, which is federal, but it's really health, which is more provincial. So Quebec went ahead and did that. Then we had Carter and C14 and Truchot and C7 and all these things going on at the federal level. So, you know, we originally had this puzzle of, it's illegal under the criminal code, but it's legal in Quebec. Fortunately, things aligned. And so you didn't have the constitutional contretemps between the federal government and Quebec, with each of them saying, you're in my sandbox. So they're together. But now what may happen is they may come apart again, in the sense that the federal government has made the decision around mental disorders. As I said, you know, mental disorders is a sole underlying condition that will be legal in 2023. What happens if Quebec decides you can't have it if you have a mental disorder as your sole underlying condition? That becomes an interesting governance question because it's a division of powers. It's what can you do that? Can you have that way? And it's of course a very political question because it's Quebec, and is a federal government going to take on Quebec and tell them they can't do this? Probably not. What would happen if another province did it? It would be different, but I think that's a curious thing because I personally don't see that it would be right for you not to be able to get something in Quebec that you can get outside, or what we had before, which was vice versa. Although I would say, you know, I said at the beginning, or I didn't note it seemed a bit tangential, but I'll note it now. We can't have MAiD tourism, as it's called, because you have to be eligible for government-funded health services. It's one of the eligibility criteria for MAiD that I simplified my list. But you can't be a foreign national and come to Canada and request and get MAiD. But you can travel between provinces. So if I'm here in Nova Scotia, if I go to Ontario, I could get MAiD. So then what happens if Quebec's different? And so you go across to Ottawa, those kinds of things. I think that's a curiosity we may see. But otherwise, I would say with respect to, governance of MAiD, I'm actually quite pleased with how it's been evolving in terms of the oversight and the regulation. We're about to have new information gathered because of this latest piece of legislation. We're going to be gathering, clinicians have to report on race, Indigenous identity, disability of people who access or request MAiD. And I think that's a really good thing. We can find out what's going on. My suspicion is we will find the opposite of what a lot of people think, i.e. they think it will show a disproportionate negative impact, harmful impact, people getting access to MAiD who shouldn't have it. They're overly vulnerable because of race and so on. I think it'll show the opposite, which is actually they don't get access where they want it, but they don't because they're disadvantaged in relation to the healthcare system. But that's those kinds of things. We're seeing some reporting changes that will, I think, help make it more transparent. People can understand what's going on and have confidence that, in fact, the system is working well.
That's really interesting, the intersection between those different factors as well. It'll be really interesting to see what that does report. This is a bit of an out there question, and if you don't want to go there, but I thought it was very interesting that came up in our chat here. In areas that we do have for-profit medicine, do you have any concerns about physicians who might set up shop to have made-for-profit clinics?
Whew.
Big question.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've been talking about this topic for a long time, and I've never had that question. Am I stumped? Well, my first knee-jerk response is to say I am in no way supportive of private pay. We have private delivery all over, but private pay is, I'm fundamentally opposed to that and a committed supporter of universal healthcare. So I would never support that because I would never support any of that kind of delivery. Would I be worried beyond that in the sense that because it's MAiD? I think we mistakenly exceptionalize MAiD. We sort of think it's unique and unlike anything else. And yeah, I don't think it is. It's certainly not unlike a lot of end-of-life decisions that people make all the time. Those won't so much happen in a private context because if you're in a hospital and you're stopping treatment or you're stopping dialysis, how would you have that in a private context? Whereas this is you'd be going somewhere for MAiD. I guess my answer would be I would hope it would never come to that because of my commitment to universal health care. Private physicians and nurse practitioners are still regulated, so I don't worry about abuse. People might be scared and think, oh, if you go private, you'll get cowboys and cowgirls and it'll be out of control, but they would all still be subject to the same criminal law and the same regulatory bodies and standards, and might well be a little bit more under the microscope of the authorities because maybe people would be concerned. So, off the top of my head, it wouldn't be a concern about abuse, but rather would be a concern about universal health care.
And thank you for that answer. I thought that was a mind-stretching activity there, but one worth addressing. That's an interesting one. We had another question that I think might be a short answer, but on what basis does the law uphold the distinction between humans and non-human animals when it comes to MAiD?
Ooh, well, the basis for that is that we in law make that distinction all the time. Right? It's a fundamental premise that you have personhood and non-human animals don't have personhood yet. So MAiD just fits in with that. A huge difference, obviously, between if people are thinking that, you know, we do allow euthanasia for non-human animals, which we didn't for humans, and now we have MAiD for humans. Well, the most fundamental difference between them is the concept of consent, because MAiD is premised on consent. You cannot have it if you don't have decision-making capacity, with the exception of the advance request, but that request must be made by somebody who has decision-making capacity, and it is their request. Nobody else can make a MAiD request for anybody else. We do not have substitute decision-making about MAiD. Of course, with non-human animals, euthanasia is entirely without consent. It is by the non-human animal. It would be rather with the consent of the quote-unquote owner. So I think MAiD makes us think about, people often bring up the concept of animals, non-human animals, in the context of euthanasia debate, because they say we do that for animals, we don't do it for humans. Fortunately, we are able to be past that debate because we have MAiD in Canada now. But it surfaces, I think, it should make us pause and question that fundamental premise, which is not unique to MAiD, but cuts across the legal system. And I stand to be corrected by people who do animal rights that there may have been developments that I'm not aware of in relation to personhood, because I know that's being litigated and mooted. That we need to think about, why do we give this privileged status to members of one species, i.e. the species Homo sapiens, but not against all the others? I mean, I have to do that. We have to do that tortured language of human, non-human animals and human animals. What is the moral significance of that species distinction? Is it simply power? Because we can. That's a fascinating, huge topic. MAiD won't help you think that through, I don't think. I don't know that it gives us any insights on that big topic. It doesn't move us in any way in relation to non-human animal rights. But it's a fascinating conceptual question.
Very interesting. I think those are the big themes that we're having coming in through our chat that I have on our screen. So some really, really interesting questions. And thank you so much for answering all of those questions that we've had. We're starting to run low on time. So Dean Hughes will offer her concluding thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frances, for chairing this part of our evening. And on behalf of the Bor-Alaskan Faculty of Law and on behalf of the entire Lakehead University and Thunder Bay community, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Thank you for your lecture tonight. Thank you for all of the ways in which you've entertained such a broad range of questions. As you know, your talk has really attracted a great deal of interest, and I'm sure that this lecture will be the subject of many dinner conversations and public policy debates, and I'm sure many discussions in the law school as we go forward. So thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and thoughtfulness with us this evening. I have a few other people that I would also like to thank. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Harold G. Fox Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event, and again thank my colleagues, Dr. Mariette Brennan and Dr. Frances Chapman, for the introduction and also the Q&A. Thank you to the folks at the TSC for your technical support this evening, to External Relations for supporting the lecture series and tonight's event. Special shout out to my assistant, Andrew McCall, for administrative support of the event tonight. And then thank you very much to everyone in the audience for your attention, for your questions, for your engagement and support of the Bor-Alaskan Faculty of Law and of this evening's event. It was just a joy to be with you all. And thank you again, Jocelyn and I know we can't have the general clapping, but I just want to express that before we leave. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a very good evening.